A very, very warm welcome to Shrabani Basu from all of us here in Mumbai. I'm delighted, Shrabani, that you've agreed to address the Museum Society this evening. And I do this on behalf of the chairman, the trustees, the Director General, Mr. Mukherjee, of the CSMVS Museum, the members of the Museum Society, my very own executive committee, and all our guests who have joined us here to hear you speak on a very intriguing and little known subject. Arthur Conan Doyle is very well known, but the mystery of the Parsee lawyer is what we are all looking forward to hearing this evening. Shrabani and I go back a few years when we coincidentally met up at the Victoria Memorial in Calcutta, thanks to the British Council of Kolkata. And at that time, she was researching a well-known subject on Queen Victoria and her Indian Munshi, Abdul. This movie, Victoria and Abdul, was subsequently made into a very well-known and popular film. But today it's going to be another subject. And just a few words about my good friend Shrabani. She's a journalist and a Sunday Times best-selling author. Her books include these two critically acclaimed novels, The Mystery of the Parsee Lawyer, which she published last year in 2021, For King and Another Country, which she published in 2015, and Victoria and Abdul in 2010. And now it's, of course, a major Oscar-nominated motion picture. She's also done The Spy Princess, The Life of Noor Inayat Khan in 2006. And Shrabani is a frequent commentator on Indian history and the empire. This lecture is, of course, a slide illustrated lecture, and she's really taken a lot of pains in her research to get the right sort of slides and the right sort of images so that we can enjoy this presentation a little more. Just a few words about what you're going to hear today. When George Edalji, a young Parsee lawyer, is convicted of mutilating horses in Staffordshire mining village in 1903, he appeals to Arthur Conan Doyle to clear his name. The creator of Sherlock Holmes accepts the request and proceeds to investigate the case. Based on letters, police records, and Home Office files, Shrabani Basu goes on this trail of Arthur Conan Doyle as he wears the hat of Sherlock Holmes and uncovers the dark secrets lying in the English countryside. It is the only case that Conan Doyle investigated personally. I don't want to let out any more, and I don't wish to stand between the speaker and the audience. So thank you once again, Shrabani, for doing us this honor. And before I hand you over, I must thank the technical team who have assisted us for the last 89 lectures now. Well done, team. And namely Yashraj, Aishwarya, Mrinalini, so ably led by Jason John. So thank you very, very much, tech team. Shrabani, over to you. Thank you. Enjoy. Sit back and relax and enjoy this most interesting talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Firoza. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to see you again, of course, on the other side of a screen. I would give anything to be in Bombay right now, but here I am in cloudy London. But thank you all for coming. Thank you to Jason John as well for organizing everything, and the Museum Society of Mumbai. It's really special to give a talk in Mumbai because this is where this story starts with George's father. And it's also special for me because my career in journalism started in Bombay, now Mumbai. So here we go. I'm going to start by actually reading a quote from one of Arthur Conan Doyle's novels. In his story, The Adventure of the Copper Beeches, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are going on this train journey, and Dr. Watson looks out at the countryside and he says, "But look at all those lonely houses, each in its own fields, filled for the most part with poor, ignorant folk who know little of the law. Think of the deeds of hellish cruelty, the hidden wickedness which may go on year in, year out in such places, and none the wiser. Well, the scene described by Watson is actually almost could be the village of Great Worley in Staffordshire, which is where our story begins. Except, of course, what happened in this mining village was for real. So bear with me while I bring up some images, and I will share my screen. So who is this Parsee lawyer, and what happened in this village of Great Worley? Well, his name is George Edalji. He's a 28-year-old lawyer. He lives in this little mining village of Great Worley, which is near Birmingham. And his father is the vicar of Great Worley. So he lives in this village. This is the vicarage of Great Worley. And his father, Shrabani Basu, is the vicar of St. Mary's Church in Great Worley. Now, Shrabani was a Parsee. He had converted to Christianity and he left Bombay to come to England. And he became a vicar of Great Worley in 1876, yes, all those years ago. So he became the first South Asian vicar, in fact, of any village or city in UK. But before I go into Shrabani, I'll just give a little bit about his background. Now, he was born in Bombay to a Parsee family. Parsees, of course, are Zoroastrians who came from Persia, fleeing Arab persecution in the 7th century AD. They settled in India, mainly in the coastal towns of Bombay and Karachi. They quickly learned the language, Gujarati, and they adapted to the local customs. They were very enterprising. They spoke, they were westernized, they educated themselves, and very quickly they started working with the East India Company officials and made their money in cotton and in the opium trade. Now, this is Shrabani Basu. He is the one who comes across. Parsees in Britain actually made quite a role for themselves. So the first, here they are in their, traditional clothes, and they were merchants. Now, the first Parsee MP, the first Indian MP in the House of Commons was actually a Parsee. His name, of course, as you all know, in India, Dadabhai Naoroji, known as the Grand Old Man of India. And he was from the Liberal Party. So this portrait of his hangs in the National Liberal Club of London. And also really interestingly, all three Indian MPs before independence in the UK were all Parsees. So Dadabhai Naoroji was followed by another Parsee, and his name was Mancharji Bhavnagari, and he was followed by Shapurji Saklatwala. So all three Parsee MPs. And of course, Parsees, as we know, they were very, very big in business. So here's the Tata families, which we're all familiar with. In UK as well, they have a big presence here with Jaguar and Land Rover. Parsees were also, of course, very talented musically, and we know Zubin Mehta, we know Freddie Mercury, who was born Farooq Balsara. But back to Shrabani, he was educated in Elphinstone College. Now, he came from a well-to-do family, so, middle class business family. He was sent to this Elphinstone elite college. And what was happening here is that there was a reverend there. His name was John Wilson. And they were targeting Parsees who were westernized, as well as Hindus from, sort of westernized, upper middle class, Brahmanical Hindus. And they found them as ripe targets for conversion. So very quickly, 4 Parsee students in Elphinstone College convert to Christianity. And Shrabani, who is just 15 at the time, he is also very influenced by Christian texts, and he wants to get baptized. So his family obviously object. He runs away from home. He goes, his house was in Colaba. He runs away. He lands up outside Reverend Wilson's house, and he wants to be converted. So Reverend Wilson takes him in. And in 1857, he is baptized in the Ambroli Church in Bombay, which is, many of you will know, it is not far from Chapati. And he makes a pretty fiery speech for a young teenager. And of course, he ends with it saying that he's finally been civilized. But now, of course, his family has rejected him, so he has nobody to go back to. He goes around various areas in Maharashtra where he is training. But what Shapoorji really wants to do is to go to England and train to be a curate. So he's quite enterprising. He writes a book. It's called, it's a dictionary of Gujarati to English, which sells very well. And with the royalties, he buys a ticket and leaves for England. So he reaches Dover, he goes to see the Canterbury Cathedral. He is full of wonder at, having arrived at this place, and he's very keen to train. So he gets his first curacy in Oxford. And then for 10 years, he's going around in various cities and villages and, working. But it's when he goes to Liverpool that he meets a young English woman called Charlotte. And they fall in love and they get married. Now, interestingly, Charlotte was also the daughter of a vicar. So he's moving very much in church circles. And they get married. Charlotte's father has no objection to her marrying a brown man from India. He welcomes Shapoorji to the family. And this is soon how the family finally, Charlotte and Shapoorji, move to Great Worley. And he becomes the vicar. There's a little bit of privilege that he pulls because she comes from a family of vicars. So, he gets in over a few others, which might have caused a bit of resentment. But anyway, this is 1876. It's the height of Victorian England. Excuse me. And here we have a brown man in this little village, which is all white, preaching the word of God to a white parish. It was a recipe for trouble, and it was going to happen. Well, within a few months, their eldest son is born, George Edalji, who is, the main person in our story. And eventually two more children are born. And here is the family in Easter 1892. You can see Shapoorji. Here's Charlotte. This is young George. He's about 15 years old at this time. His younger brother Horace, and the youngest sister is Maud. But of course, the family at this time is already under a cloud, because life is not going to be easy for this colored family in this village. So the trouble starts when George is barely 12 years old. The first thing that Shapoorji sees one day is that somebody has painted graffiti outside the church. And they have written, the Edaljis are wicked. Well, he thinks nothing of it. He, cleans it up and he goes on with his work. But this abuse is going to carry on. They're going to receive letters. Suddenly, anonymous letters are left at the door, little notes, scraps of paper, and something like this. I mean, these are all there now in the police files in UK where I access them. And you can see this, for your bloody father, Reverend Edalji. And you can see these drawings and crude sketches, and they're all very abusive. They're also threatening. They say, we're going to poison your water supply. So Shapoorji gets really worried, and he obviously he goes to the police. The police basically do nothing. They watch the vicarage for some time. They're not too bothered. And then they come and examine everybody's writing. And then they finally arrest the maid. She is 17 years old. Her name is Elizabeth Foster. They find her handwriting is similar and they arrest her. Now, at the police station, Elizabeth Foster has a lawyer, and she says he pleads with Shapoorji, and he says that if she is charged and she goes to trial, her reputation will be ruined. She's very young. Please let her go. And the vicar, he's a kindly man. He says, okay. And he thinks this is the end of the matter. But Elizabeth Foster leaves this police station, swearing her innocence and saying that she's going to have her revenge. Well, things are quiet for about 6 months, and then they start again. So once more, the letters begin. And you can see in this, it's calling for revenge and it's abusive. And now they are threatening George. The letters are so graphic. They're actually saying they're going to send him to his grave. I mean, this must have been terrifying for the vicar, his family, his wife, the little children. Notes are left all around. And also at this time, he's subjected to a lot of hoaxes. So suddenly letters are going out in his name, signed by Shapoorji, to tradesmen in the area, saying, we need tiles, or the roof needs mending, or the plumbing needs some attention. And these tradesmen land up, and they find there's nothing wrong. Deliveries of cement and tiles arrive, and he has to send them back. So it's all very embarrassing for him. He actually puts an advert in the newspaper saying, please, somebody's playing hoaxes on me. Please check with me before, sending any deliveries. There are also letters going out to the doctors saying, Mrs. Edalji is very ill, please come. And a doctor comes rushing in and finds there's nothing wrong with Charlotte. So, he's wasted his time, he's annoyed, the vicar is embarrassed, and this goes on for several months. Once again, he goes to the police. And do the police do anything? No. In fact, what's worse is that the police start thinking that the person behind this is actually young George Edalji. For some reason, the policeman, his name is Sergeant Upton, is convinced that it is George who is playing all these pranks and writing these letters. And why George would be, he wouldn't even have had the pocket money to put advertisements in papers. But, there we are. The police are convinced. And this goes on. So we have a whole lot of letters, which I'll show you. I mean, scraps of paper, like I said. So this is just a cutting from a magazine showing a beggar woman. And he's just scrawled your mother on it and sent it there. These are, sort of letters where there is the streak of mania in the person, because he says, I am God and I'm God Satan. And, threatening letters like this being constantly sent to the vicar. And in this, you can see he's just saying, he's calling him a pig, I'm a dangerous man, and, saying, leave £5 for me under the door, etc. And so the volley of abuse just goes on and on. And this is going on over several years. By now, George, who's, when it started when he was about 12 years old, is now in secondary school. He's very studious, he's good at his work, and he starts going to a grammar school, the Rugli Grammar School. He takes a train every morning, and he travels with other school children. But the abuse is constantly going on. And one day, something rather weird happens. A big key is deposited outside the vicarage. And when the vicar hands it in, Sergeant Upton, of course, thinks that, oh, this has been brought by George. Now, it's soon revealed that the key belongs to a school called the Walsall Grammar School. George goes to another school 6 miles away, the Rugli Grammar School. So now there's no earthly reason that George will travel 6 miles, steal a school key, and then put it outside the vicarage. I mean, it absolutely defies logic. But Sergeant Upton is not going, down the logic path. He is determined and convinced that it is George. No other person is doing this. So he actually writes his report. He writes a report to the chief constable, of Staffordshire Police, Captain Anson, and says all this is being done by George. Now, Captain Anson is a man who is from the aristocracy. He lives in this huge country estate. He has, he's part of the imperial connection and, a total colonial to the boot. His ancestors were given Victoria Crosses for suppressing the mutiny. His house is full of treasures from China and Hong Kong. And of course, he hates this family in the vicarage. He sees no reason why a brown man with faltering Indian accented English should be preaching to a white parish. He's also contemptuous of Charlotte, the white woman who's married Shapuji. It's like Charlotte has let down the side. And of course, he's ready to believe anything. He's ready to believe that George has done these things. And he dismisses Shapuji and he calls him the Hindu vicar, in quotes. Of course, he was not a Hindu at all. But there we are. Everyone was called a Hindu at that time. So, George, nothing is proved about the key, obviously. Nobody knows who stole it. No, not a shred of evidence. But what happens with this incident is that it brings George directly under the radar of the Staffordshire police. And he is just 17 years old at this time. Now, Shapuji, the word goes around around this village that George is involved, and you can imagine a small village, gossip spreads fast. And Shapuji gets to hear of it, and he is really annoyed. He writes to Anson, and he says, "Come visit me in the vicarage." And he sends, this is the map of the vicarage. He says, "There's no way George would have written those letters and put them in the door, and come and see us, see how we are placed." But of course, Anson is too arrogant to come out of his country house and visit the vicarage. So he doesn't bother. And this goes on. The abuse just goes on. It's like, he's just given a whole new lease of life to the anonymous letter writer, who is, as I said, almost, maniacal, because one day he deposits not just the letters, he deposits 72 objects outside the vicarage. Stuff like bootlaces, a purse, various absolutely insignificant, a little penknife, rubbers. Finally, the family at the vicarage, they just give up. They said the police are not going to do anything, and they just decide to move on with their lives. But suddenly, it stops in 1895, after years of abuse. And they don't know what's happened. Suddenly, the family can breathe freely. George, by now, has finished school. He's graduated. He's gone to Birmingham University. He's graduated in law. He's done very well. He has a bronze certificate. He's even got admission he has now joined a law firm in Birmingham. And his wall proudly displays his certificates and his medals. And life seems to be, getting on slowly back for the Edalji family. George, who's very, like his father, liked to write, he even wrote a book. It's called The Guide to Railway Law for Commuters, The Man in the Train. And it was even reviewed in the local papers. So, some of the villagers were actually quite proud. We have a writer in our midst. But, of course, things are not going to go well. Things are going to take a nasty turn in Great Worley. In 1903, at the turn of the century, now the village of Great Worley becomes the center of a series of brutal crimes as horses, pit ponies, cows are mutilated and left to die in the field. So suddenly somebody is coming in at night, slashing the cattle and leaving them to die. So their innards are spilling out on this clayey soil. They are discovered early in the morning by the miners. And it is absolutely horrific. People come from surrounding villages. The village of Worley becomes known as the village of fear. The police are there. There's also a voyeuristic pleasure that people are getting. Any crime, gruesome crime, always attracts people for some reason. So they come and they look at these ghastly mutilations, and it's left to the workmen who have to take them away on these horse carts. I haven't shown you the grisly images, but they were there. They were really photographed. And the farmers are terrified because it is happening regularly and the police can't do anything. So they lock up their cattle at night. Women and children are told not to go out after dark. There is a real fear setting into this village. And because the police can't catch anybody, the rumors are flying. And when things like this happen, um, they take a sinister turn. And here, what surfaces again are anonymous letters. The writer is back, or is it a new writer? We don't know. But now these abusive letters are taking it one step further. They start accusing George of mutilating animals. They start writing to the police, abusing the police as well, taunting them that you missed him while he slashed these animals. You're not doing your job. And then some of the letters are sent to George, some are sent to the police, and some are sent to a young boy called Greatorex, Wilfred Greatorex. He's just an 11-year-old in the village, and they are sent to him. And some of the letters are signed William Greatorex. So nothing makes any sense. The police are doing nothing. They are just, allegedly looking out, monitoring the fields. They start taking a keen interest in George, whose name keeps coming up in these anonymous letters. And as one knows, when there is fear and there are rumors, who do you suspect? It's this odd family in the village, the only dark family, the mixed race family, the vicar, dark-skinned vicar, his 3 mixed race children, this lonely boy, who is, the eldest son, who was accused earlier. So suddenly George, and let me tell you a little bit about George. So he was a loner. He leads a really boring life. He goes every day at the same train. He catches the same train and he goes to his office in Birmingham. He catches the same train and he comes back. He doesn't drink, so he doesn't go with his mates to the pub after work. He has few friends. He usually comes back and actually meets clients in the vicarage. He is in his 20s. He still lives with his family in the vicarage. And the only thing is he's very close to his sister Maud. They go for long walks. And of course, as these rumors keep spreading, these long walks transform into prowling in the dark. So here they are, all of them thinking, the village thinking, is it George? Is it the vicar's son? And now the police are watching the vicarage. And here we have a new policeman, because if you remember Sergeant Upton, he was actually dismissed on charges of drinking. So he's gone, but he's been replaced by Inspector Campbell. But Inspector Campbell has inherited the same prejudice from Sergeant Upton. So he too is convinced in his own way that it's George. Well, the police are doing everything. They're watching the vicarage. They have secretly even got bloodhounds, but they can't catch this thief. He comes in at night, slashes the cattle and gets away. He's called the Whirly Ripper, with sort of echoes and memories of Jack the Ripper. Few years ago was traumatizing London, and the papers are full of it. And of course, we still don't have a killer. So what do we do? On August, here's Inspector Campbell again. Yeah, on August the 18th, when a horse is found dead, mutilated, just about half a mile from the vicarage, the police step in and they decide to arrest George. Inspector Campbell, of course, here he is. He's very sure that it's George. They go to his office in Birmingham and arrest him. Then they go to the vicarage and they remove a coat, which they say has horsehairs on it. They remove a pair of boots and they remove a razor. Now, when they take this coat away, the Shahpurji takes it to the window and he says there are no horsehairs. It's just some wool, some roving. But of course, the police are convinced, they don't care. Then they take away, they say there's some blood on the razor. They say the boots are wet. And they question George, who says he had not left that night. He had come back from work and he had stayed in the vicarage. He'd gone for a little walk. He was back in the vicarage by 9 o'clock in the evening, had not stepped out till the next day, till it was, time for him to go to work. And there were several witnesses. His parents were there. The maid was there. They all knew he was at home. But of course, the police are not convinced. And George is arrested. Here he is, with the police arrest photo. You can see by August, he's been arrested. He is prisoner 3460. He looks terrible, as anyone would do in a police photograph. He describes later his first night in the cell. It's in the book, what a horrible night he has. But then, of course, it goes into trial. Now, a case that was so important should have had a really senior judge looking at it, but instead it goes to one of the lowest courts with a very inexperienced judge who is ill-equipped to deal with serious crime. And this case is heard in this court in Staffordshire. Now, the crowds, because this is going to get coverage in the media, the crowds descend on this tiny courtroom, shoving and screaming their way to get a little place, because it's a very tiny room. The women come with picnic baskets and hats, and it's like a Sunday outing, a bit of sport. They all come to watch this man who has caused these, heinous crimes in Great Worley. And of course, the press are there in full force. They are watching the trial, they are reporting, and the press coverage focuses almost entirely on George as the mysterious Oriental. So I'm going to read a few extracts from the coverage. So the Daily Gazette writes about his swarthy face with its full dark eyes, prominent mouth, and small round chin. His appearance is essentially Oriental in its stolidity, no sign of emotion escaping him beyond a faint smile. Others report, they've been talking to the villagers, and they report that the villagers believe that Parsees, who worship the fire and the sun, regularly carry out nocturnal sacrifices of animals. So of course, they've got everything mixed up, in the brains of these villagers is this, it's pure ignorance. And apart from that, of course, they're thinking of, books they've read about the Thuggy cult and the sacrifices to Kali made by the bandits. And they've, confused it with Parsees. And here they have this story that this man is going out and sacrificing animals because he comes from a mysterious religion from the East. And of course, George Edalji, who is born in England, he is baptized in this church, is still seen as a foreigner. And of course, I'll read one more extract from the press. Well, here are the reporters who were taken around to, to the various sites and the scene of crime. The Daily Mail writes, those who have closely studied this extraordinary criminal in the dock would have no doubt that he is a degenerate of the worst type. His jaw and mouth are those of a man of very debased life. Edalji has also gained for himself the reputation of being a lover of mystery, another Oriental trait, and one that goes far to explain the anonymous letters. The Birmingham Daily Gazette writes, the explanation of the choice is probably to be found in the circumstances that Edalji is of Eastern extraction. The subtle Eastern mind loves a mystery and is vain. So as you can see, the whole focus is on his racial origins and ethnic roots. So the trial lasted 4 days. It took just 50 minutes for the jury to pronounce George guilty. And the judge sentenced him to 7 years penal servitude. So of course, it's absolute shock for the Edalji family. Peaceful as they were, leading an ordinary life, and Shapuji as the vicar. So here he is, you can see his careworn face over here. And he's somebody who left everything behind in Bombay, and he thought he was, going to a civilized country and there was the rule of law. And here he was facing racism, his son locked up in prison and disbarred from being a solicitor. But Shapuji doesn't give up the fight. He's got a fight in him. He and Charlotte, his wife, they campaign for George. They start a petition. And soon the reporting of this case reaches some legal experts, and they say that, there were many flaws in this trial, and they bring it up. So this petition for George actually gathers 10,000 signatures. and from his school teachers, academics, other lawyers, and they all say that there's been a miscarriage. But you know, it's nothing can be done. The Home Office is not moved. But suddenly, after 3 years, George is released. He's released quietly on parole, but he remains disbarred from the service, from acting as a lawyer. And of course, he has, he still has the charge hanging over him. He's just out on license. So George comes out, after he's released from prison, he doesn't know what to do. He can't go back to Great Worley because he feels that if there is another killing, he's going to be accused again and locked up. So he goes to London. He meets his father only one day. His mother comes to London and starts paying for lodgings for him. George, who was quite a writer, he liked to write, remember? So he wrote an article. This is a pamphlet brought out by Shapurji, who campaigns for him and writes the case of George Edalji, after which, the signatures start. But George writes his own story in the Umpire and says, told by himself, talking about the miscarriage of justice. But, nobody was listening. He is still disbarred from practicing. He doesn't know what to do. He has no income. He's depending on his father's, small income. His mother is supporting him. So George takes a decision that is going to change his life. He picks up his pen and he writes to Arthur Conan Doyle, one of the best known novelists of the time, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. And why does he choose him? Because he's been reading Arthur Conan Doyle's books while he was in prison. And he feels that somebody who created Sherlock Holmes, who displays this logic and finds these criminals, is the only person who can help him. So he's bold enough. He writes to Arthur Conan Doyle and he says, help me. So Arthur Conan Doyle, one day, this letter drops through his post. He's even got the copy, sends a copy of the cutting of the Umpire magazine, his article. Now, the time that Arthur Conan Doyle gets this letter is a time when the writer himself is actually going through a dark phase in his life. His wife, Louise, had just died a few months ago. She died of tuberculosis. And he had looked after her for 13 years. But apart from this loss at her death, he's also overcome with a sense of guilt, because while he was looking after Louise, he also fell in love. He fell in love with a young woman called Jean Leckie. And now he was free to marry her. So that made him feel even more guilty, as if, he was waiting for Louise to die. So he was in a very dark space. He was in a dark space, just like his fictional hero, Sherlock Holmes, often is. And suddenly this letter comes through. And here's a chance to do something, to, distract him from this, to champion the cause of somebody who is, been marginalized, who's a miscarriage of justice that he could challenge. And Arthur Conan Doyle takes this case and he says he's going to take it on. So, of course, what does he do? He invites George to meet him. So George is invited. He calls him to the Charing Cross Hotel in Trafalgar Square. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle is a bit late to arrive. And as he enters the room, he stands near the door and he observes. And George Edalji is sitting in the lobby. He's already there waiting for him. And he's reading a newspaper. But he was reading the newspaper, holding it really close to his face. And Arthur Conan Doyle makes two deductions immediately. So just like his, excuse me, just like his fictional hero, Sherlock Holmes, makes these deductions before he's even started on a case. Excuse me. Arthur Conan Doyle stands there and realizes that George is myopic, severely myopic. And with such myopia, he deduces that he could not have crossed these fields in the middle of the night. The night of August 18th was dark and stormy, and he could not have crossed these fields and slashed cattle and got back. It was impossible. So already he knows that George is most probably, he is actually innocent. So he asks him, were you myopic? Was this brought up in the trial? And George says no. So he says, okay, we're going to get your eyes tested professionally. And the first thing he does is send him to get his eyes tested. But Arthur Conan Doyle has to go to he jumps into this investigation. He is going to go to the scene of crime. And he goes to Great Worley one day in January, early, it's cold. He takes the train from London to Birmingham. He's sitting there in the carriage with a newspaper covering his face, so fellow passengers don't sort of recognize him. He changes trains at Birmingham. He goes to Great Worley, walks to the vicarage, knocks on the door, and is greeted by Shapurji and Charlotte. He has breakfast with them, and he hears their story. He hears about how they have been attacked for years. He hears about the anonymous letters. He hears about the abuse. He hears about how George was singled out, the trial where, the police weren't helpful, the trial where, all these facts were brought up which had no basis. And finally, this sentence and what it did to George because he's been disbarred. He cannot work. So Arthur Conan Doyle hears this and he is really moved by their plight. He is determined to fight for this family. So the game, as he says in his books, was afoot. And he then goes to the scene of crime. He walks to the field where these killings took place. He tests the soil. He goes and interviews all the villagers. He goes to the pub. He shares a pint with local villagers. He wants to know what the story is. And then his final call is to Captain Anson, the chief of Staffordshire police. Now, Captain Anson, as I said, was an arrogant man who did not like the Edaljis. And of course, Arthur Conan Doyle immediately senses that he is prejudiced, that he is racist, and he reveals nothing, but he goes back with this fact that the police obviously were racist and prejudiced against George. So he goes back to London, he goes back to his house in Surrey, and he writes his piece. And this is Captain Anson, Chief of Staffordshire Police. So he goes back, and in a few days, he publishes the first of his articles in the Daily Telegraph. It's called The Case of Mr. George Edalji. As you can see the spread, it was all the columns in the newspaper, and it caused a sensation. Suddenly, George, this article was reproduced in newspapers, in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in newspapers across England, and everybody was reading about it. Everybody found that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was investigating this case. Even Jawaharlal Nehru, who was just a young student in Harrow at the time, followed the case, and he wrote to his father, Motilal Nehru, and he said that this case it just revealed that it was definitely George was getting all this prejudice because he was Indian. So even he was involved following this case. Anyway, Arthur Conan Doyle himself, of course, he is lauded by fellow authors. So George Bernard Shaw, Bram Stoker, all of them, they all, praise Arthur Conan Doyle for taking up this case. And George, of course, is famous. His photograph is in the newspapers. He is all over. He becomes known in the US and known in the UK. And what Arthur Conan Doyle does is with his forensic examination of the evidence that is brought up at the trial, he pulls down each bit of evidence and says it was not worth even being admitted in the court. And so he says very clearly that it was, he criticizes the police, and he says there was racial prejudice that led to Edalji's conviction. And what's more, he brings up the fact for the first time that George was myopic. So this had not been raised in the trial. He also brings up the fact that the Edalji's were persecuted for years in the vicarage. So all the bit about the anonymous letters, none of this was brought up in the trial. And suddenly the people of UK are reading this. This is what was happening in this village. And Arthur Conan Doyle becomes like the conscience of the nation. And he reveals racism, incompetence, prejudice has led to this conviction. Conan Doyle also goes as far as to compare this case with the Dreyfus affair in France. Now, the Dreyfus affair was something that happened in the late 19th century, where, the late 20th century, where, the late 19th century, where Albert Dreyfus, was accused, a Jewish man was accused of selling military secrets to the Germans. So he was tried and arrested and exiled, but it was revealed that Dreyfus was innocent, and it was actually a French military officer who had sold the secrets. But when this is revealed, the police try to cover it up, and so it became, quite a famous case as the Dreyfus affair. And at that time, the British were saying that the French are anti-Semitic and taking a high moral stand. So Arthur Conan Doyle now questions the British themselves and says, here you were when the Dreyfus affair happened, questioning France, but now this is happening at your doorstep. The Dreyfus affair happened with a Jew. This is happening with a Parsee, but it is the same thing. It's the same thing of the police covering up a crime and their prejudice. Now, the Dreyfus affair led to the famous French writer Émile Zola writing this letter, this article, saying, I accuse to the French government. And Arthur Conan Doyle, by championing George Edalji, was sort of, being the Émile Zola of Britain at this moment and doing his je accuse to the British Home Office and police. Now, George, too, of course, wanted to write his story. So remember, he loved writing, and here he is. He wrote it in the Pearson's Weekly and published. As you can see, that's his signature there. And he wrote, I am innocent, George Edalji. So this was published over several weeks in the Pearson's Weekly. And finally, with all this pressure, the Home Office had to set up a committee. They set up a committee, and it actually pardons George. So he gets a free pardon, but there is a sting in the tail. They give him no compensation because they say that he has written the anonymous letters and he brought this trouble on himself. So, of course, Arthur Conan Doyle is absolutely incensed. He says, either the man is innocent and deserves compensation, or he is guilty of the crime and deserves punishment. So he is absolutely furious with the Home Office, as is George and Shapoorji, because they said, if you're not compensated, what does it mean? So over the next few months, now Conan Doyle goes into the second phase of his campaign. He says, this far, I have tried to prove that George didn't do it, that George was innocent. He now pushes it up a second year, and he says he is going to reveal who did it. So the next stage of his investigation starts. And now, of course, he's going to clash directly with, guess who? Captain Anson, who is the man who has been told that his police force was inefficient. And Anson is furious because he's not going to take lessons in policing from a writer of crime stories. So there is a huge ego clash that takes place between Anson and Conan Doyle, two Victorian gentlemen who are going hammer and tongs at each other, which is all quite amusing, and which is, stuff I found in the police files. And Anson goes to the extent of actually, this was absolutely revealing, that he actually starts laying false trails for Arthur Conan Doyle so that he'd get stripped up in his investigation. But Arthur Conan Doyle is unflapped. He carries on. He is doing the job of what the police should have done. He's even trying to, these are his articles that he writes. He says this must have been the instrument. He interviews people. He goes, he follows up the story. He does independent handwriting analysis. And of course, he's taking it to completely the next level. And he says that he is going to start proving who wrote these letters. So he starts another series of articles in which he publishes the anonymous letters in the papers, sort of, copy images of these. So this is the anonymous letter. And next to it, he publishes an actual letter written by George with George's signature. And he asks the public to compare them and say, was this the same handwriting? He goes to independent handwriting experts and finds the same things and reveals their results. So there is a real clash setting up between Home Office, Arthur Conan Doyle, and Anson. So does Arthur Conan Doyle solve the case of the Whirly Ripper? Does he reveal who did it? You're probably wondering. But of course, I'm not going to tell you because you have to read the book and find out. It was one of the greatest miscarriages of justice at the turn of the century. And it was also the only case that Arthur Conan Doyle investigates personally. But you're also probably wondering what happened to George Edalji. So I will tell you that. He is eventually readmitted, thanks to Arthur Conan Doyle, to the solicitor's roles. He can start practice again, but he doesn't go back to Great Whirley. He still feels that he will not go back there in case something happens. He practices in London, and he lives reasonable life, I guess. There is much curiosity about him, so he gets clients out of curiosity, and he gets clients who don't want to go to him. So it's a mixed bag, really. His offices are bombed in the Second World War, and then he goes and lives with his sister after that. Here is a picture of the older George. But slowly over the years, while the Dreyfus affair in France is so well known, there are books on it, there are films on it, there's recently a TV series on it. The case of George Edalji has been completely forgotten. He is somebody who's just even though the greatest writer of that time was championing his cause. Why was this? Maybe because he was an Indian, who knows? But I think the single contribution of George Edalji was that his case led to a change of law. So it led to the introduction of the Criminal Court of Appeal in the UK. So up till then, if you were convicted, you had no recourse. So all you could do was send pleas to the Home Office. There was no higher appeal court that you could go to. But after 1907, the Criminal Appeals Court was set up. And, people can now go to higher courts and they can go right up to the Supreme Court as well. So, thanks to George, there was a change of law. But George himself was forgotten. And his story is, it's lying in police files and in various archives where I found them. But I wanted to find his grave because I knew he was buried in Welwyn Garden City, which is about 20 miles outside London. He lived there with his sister Maud. And it took me 4 hours to find his grave, even though the plot was marked, because it was completely covered. As you can see, there were just these weeds. It was completely overgrown. So, I had no idea whose grave it was. And finally, on some hunch, I literally pulled off these weeds and, here was the names. The first name that came up was Thompson, and his full name was George Edward Thompson Edalji, and here was the Edalji faint. And then, of course, I discovered that Maud, his sister, was also buried in the same grave. So both of them didn't have children. So the Edalji family sort of dies with them, really, no descendants. His brother Horace went off to Ireland. He cut himself off from the family and he died in Ireland. He's buried there. He took his wife's surname and is buried there as Horace McGee. So he cut off links with his family. I think he just had enough of, just being persecuted and the everything that George had gone through because of his color, his skin. I think he just wanted to cut himself off from his roots totally and just go somewhere else. So Horace left the family, and that was the end of the Edalji family in UK. So yes, I will end the story there, and I'm very happy to take questions and bring up more points after this. But thank you all for listening.